everyone, I'm Catherine and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I primarily post videos about true crime, so old true crime, historic true crime cases, but also current popular true crime cases like Depp v. Heard and the Alec Baldwin shooting on the set of Rust. So if this type of content interests you, please subscribe to my channel. If you're a returning subscriber, you'll know that I'm from Australia. I'm from a little city that is close to Sydney, New South Wales. And this video really hits home because the murder took place in West Sydney, which is really close to where I live. Now, if you're a bit of a true crime buff, you've probably already heard of the gruesome, horrific Anita Cobby case. And if you haven't, I've done a video on that case. The Anita Cobby case was and remains referred to in the true crime community as one of Australia's worst and most gruesome true crime cases ever. And this case is eerily similar to the Anita Cobby case. Now, in this case, we're going to be discussing the Janine Balding case. In this video, I'm going to give you a summary of the facts leading up to the horrific murder of Janine. I'm going to talk to you about what actually happened during the murder, and it's not for the faint-hearted. I'm then going to give you the outcome of the people who murdered Janine, so what did they receive by way of criminal sentence, and I'm going to give you an update with respect to where the murderers are at today. Let's jump right in. I have a bit of a head cold at the time of filming this, so I apologise for the nasally voice in advance. Janine Kerry Balding was born on 7 October 1967 in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, Australia. Her parents were Beverly and Kerry Balding, and she had a younger brother named David. David was 10 years old at the time she was murdered. In 1988, 20-year-old Janine was living in the beachside suburb of Cronulla in Sydney. And Cronulla is really known for its beautiful beaches. It's a really nice area in Sydney. Janine was engaged to a man named Stephen Warren, and they were set to be married in March of 1989. The couple purchased and owned a home on the central coast of New South Wales. So the central coast is about 45 to 50 minutes away from where I live. So as I said, this really hits close to home. In 1988, Janine's wedding and her 21st birthday were fast approaching, so she was only 21 years old. So Sydney is really heavily populated, so it's very common for people who work in Sydney to catch the train to and from work, and Janine did this. So on the 8th of September 1988, it was just like any other day. Janine caught the train into work, and when she finished work, she intended to catch the train home. Unfortunately, on the 8th of September 1988, Janine didn't make it home, and her parents and her partner, her fiancé, had to file a missing persons report. A few days after she was reported missing, her body was found in a paddock at a place in Western Sydney called Minchinbury. It was very clear that she'd been tortured and that she'd really suffered in her final moments. The bizarre thing was that two young boys led police to the body, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. And the 14-year-old would eventually become the youngest killer to be sentenced for the maximum penalty in Australia in respect of the murder. But we'll get there. The 14-year-old boy's name was Bronson Brethington, and there was a 16-year-old boy who was involved named Matthew Elliott. Everyone in the public was freaking out because they wanted to know, were the boys involved who had brutally assaulted and killed this young woman when she was just trying to catch a train home after work, like so many people in Sydney did. So when the 14 and the 16-year-old, Bronson and Matthew, spoke to police, it became clear that they were from low socioeconomic demographics, and they spent a lot of time living on the streets of Sydney and spending a lot of time at Central Station, the train station. The two boys had disclosed to a social worker that they were involved in the brutal attack and beating of a boy, another street boy named Wayne, and it involved Bronson actually belting him with a sledgehammer. In response to this disclosure, the social worker or the youth worker actually reported the two boys to police, which led the police to interview and speak to the two boys. Now, during the police interviews, they both disclosed, without being prompted, that they were aware of where Janine, the woman who had been missing and reported all over the news, they said unprompted that they knew where her body was. The two boys led the police to the rural paddock, and that's when they discovered Janine's body, and I'll go into the details about that later. The question on everyone's mind is, how did they know where the body was? They both denied having any involvement with her attack or the murder. The two boys didn't need to confess because soon after they led the police to the woman's body, to Janine's body, a 22-year-old man by the name of Stephen Shorty Jamison confessed and disclosed to the police what he says actually had occurred. Now, Stephen had fatal alcohol syndrome disorder, which actually you can see by his appearance. So I'll put a photo of him up here. So this occurs when a mother consumes alcohol and while she's pregnant, and this is what the consequence can be. So he wasn't quite as street as the two other boys, but he was involved in street gangs and associated with people, the young gangs who would be violent, who would routinely and frequently hang out at Central Station, the train station in Sydney. So Stephen Jamison told police that he himself and 4 other street kids, 2 male, 1 female, all between the ages of 14 and 16 years old, had abducted, assaulted and killed Janine Balding on September 8. The Australian public were shocked and horrified that kids so young were capable of the brutal and gruesome murder. It was all anyone was talking about at the time. 5 young kids, other than 22-year-old Stephen. The other strange thing psychologically is that these street kids, they didn't know each other. They had no prior relationship before the 8th of September, and so the murder of Janine was somewhat sporadic, and it really shows how much of an influence that the young people had on each other in this gang mentality when they were together, and how it really escalated the situation. Unfortunately, it became clear that Janine was just at the wrong place at the wrong time, which is why they targeted her. A woman at a train station who was by herself. Let's take a little bit of a look at the 14-year-old Bronson Blethington. So he was fresh out of juvenile detention in September of 1988. He was living on the streets. At age 6, his parents got divorced, which he says traumatized him. For part of his childhood, he lived at a caravan park, and he says that he was assaulted by 3 men frequently while he lived at this caravan park. 2 men who also lived at the caravan park would frequently assault him whilst he was in the shower blocks. And he says that one of his dad's friend would also routinely assault him. So he had a very troubled upbringing. Blethington said that the assaults on him growing up were so painful that he would routinely pass out as a result of the pain. By the age of 13, Blethington struggled at school and he was illiterate. To cope with his home life and the abuse, he began skipping school and selling drugs. He began training at the gym. He grew in size and gained muscle. He began routinely getting into fights, and his dad wanted to send him to a boys' home, but instead, Blethington was sent to a drug rehab where he spent his days listening to stories from other adult participants, which he says caused him further trauma. Whilst he was in rehab, a psychiatrist actually reported that he had the mental capacity of a 9-year-old. Eventually, Blethington's father sent him to a boys' home when he was released from the rehab, and the boys' home did little to help his behaviour. Blethington got into trouble for fighting and disrespecting staff. When he finished school, none of his family wanted to take him back, so he had nowhere to live. And he apparently called his mum and begged, "Can I come home and live with you?" And the mother said, "No, you need to demonstrate a change in your behaviour before I'll let you back into my house." So he returned soon after to the juvenile detention centre, and he started living on the street when he was released. He celebrated his 14th birthday whilst living on the streets in Sydney. On the 8th of September 1988, Blethington got off the train at Central Station in Sydney mid-morning. His friend from juvenile detention introduced him to more hardened street kids. The kids involved 16-year-old Matthew Elliott, 15-year-old Wayne Wilmot, and Elliott and Wilmot told Blethington that they were a feared gang and that they invited him to hang out with them. Blethington's friends were impressed by his ability to fight and steal. Blethington punched another kid, Wayne, who I mentioned earlier in the video, in an attempt to show off his street cred to the other kids. Blethington that day brutally belted Wayne Purchase with a sledgehammer, and the other street kids egged him on and praised him for his ability to belt him. Again, this is that gang mentality, and you can see how they're all feeding off each other and trying to prove that they're the hardest and that they have, they're being praised for their ability to be physically abusive to people. Blethington actually said that he thought that he had killed Wayne with the sledgehammer during this attack. That's how brutal it was. After this, Blethington, Elliot and Wilmot met up with two more street kids at Central Station in Sydney. A 15-year-old woman or girl named Carol Ann Arrow, and a 22-year-old, so the man I mentioned before, Stephen Jamison. So both Stephen and Carol were described as intellectually challenged. They had both run away from home and could be referred to as the most naive out of the bunch of 5 street kids. The group of 5 were strangers before September 8, and that's a really important note. There was no planning or loyalties or ties between the group members. They just met on this day and were trying to prove who was the hardest in the gang. The events that unfolded on 8 September were sporadic, evil decisions of children, other than the 22-year-old man. You have to think about the gang mentality here. So Elliot and Wilmot allegedly suggested to the group, why don't we grab a Sheila and R-word her, R-A-E her. That sentence was the headline on almost every newspaper in Australia that year. When it came out who was involved, that was the headline. Let's grab a Sheila and her. Blethington later denied that anyone had made that comment, but other people in the gang had said, yes, that was what was said, that was the plan. Blethington maintained that the gang's plan was actually to steal a car. So the group of 5 spent the afternoon riding the train through Sydney, drinking stolen rum, taking pills and causing havoc. The group got off at Sutherland train station. They found a stolen car and tried to start the ignition. One of the group members then suggested that the group follow a woman to her car and forcibly take her keys and then steal her car. The group of 5 first targeted a woman named Christine Southerly, who was walking towards her car from Sutherland railway station. She was approached by the kids. One of the kids asked for a cigarette, which is when Christine, apparently looked at the group and noticed one of them had a knife, and she thought really fast on her feet. She jumped in the car and locked the door quickly and then drove off, and this really startled her and she was really, really shaken up. She drove home and she actually ended up telling her partner that she'd been approached by the kids in the car park, in the train station car park, and she was really shaken up. You know, they had a knife and she thought they were up to no good. So she and her partner drove past the train station and they saw the kids were still there. They saw them approach another woman who, you know, we believe that woman was Janine. They headed straight to the police station where Christine filed a police report and the police acted straight away. But the police, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with train stations, what they look like in Australia. Usually they go up like this and they've got 2 sides. And apparently the police went to the wrong side, not the side where they saw the kids approach the other woman. So they started investigating and looking in the wrong side. And by the time the police got to the other side and got it right, the gang and the woman that Christine had seen, Janine, were gone. So from his statement, what we know is that Janine was approached while she was trying to get into her Holden Gemini, which was parked at the train station. Again, one of the kids asked her for a cigarette. Janine told the kids, I don't smoke. And one of the kids pulled out a knife and threatened to cut Janine before ordering her into the back of her car. Elliot got into the driver's seat of the car and the rest loaded into the back and front passenger seat with Janine. The group drove towards the suburb of Mitchenberry in Western Sydney. During the drive, Janine was partially stripped and she was held at knife point. Now, if you are familiar with the Anita Cobby case, this is almost like identical, this part. Elliot then got into the back seat and Wayne Wilmot got into the driver's seat. Apparently, Wilmot and Carol Ann did not take part in the assault, but the rest of them proceeded to assault her while she was in the car and as they drove. So the group brought Janine to the field. They gagged her and they bound her so she couldn't move. They dragged her from the car into the paddock. They continued to assault her. They dragged her body to a dam which was in the paddock. It was Brethington who grabbed Janine's head and he held her head underwater while the others stood around and watched. Elliot punched her in the stomach, and he later said that he did this so she would choke on more water and drink more water and drown faster. Again, Stephen Jamison says he didn't take part in the actual physical actions, but he was there, and he's the one who later told police about what had happened. And also the girl, the woman, she was not involved in the actual physical part of the attack either, or the murder. So the next day it was Bronson Blethington and Matthew Elliott, so they returned to the detention centre where they had been staying the week prior. And Blethington admitted to the youth worker that he had belted Wayne Purchase with the sledgehammer earlier that week to within an inch of his life. The social worker then disclosed the report to police, and this is when the police interviewed Elliott and Bronson Blethington. The pair disclosed to police that they knew where her body was, unprompted. So of course the police were like, okay, this is suspicious, how would they know? Now, the interesting thing is that Bronson and Matthew Elliott, they actually pointed the finger at someone else who was, not with the 5 group members, but who was kind of associated with the street kids. So they actually said, we know who did it, it was him. Maybe to deflect blame because they thought someone might have seen them or something. I'm speculating here, but they pointed the finger at another one of the street kids. When the police spoke to that member of the gang, they had a watertight alibi that they were not there at the time of the murder. So of course the police then said, well, our direction and our attention is on these 2 boys. They directed us to the body. They've given us a bum steer with respect to another street kid who has a watertight alibi. They're the primary suspect. Eventually, all 5 of the people that were present when Janine was murdered were charged, and they were all convicted. So let's talk about the sentences each of them received. So the trial went to court in 1990, 2 years after the murder. So there's Bronson Blethington, Matthew Elliott, Stephen Jemison. All 3 of them got life plus 25 years. And the reason this case is so well known, other than the stark resemblance it has to the facts of Anita Cobby, is the fact that Bronson Blethington, the 14-year-old, he became the youngest Australian criminal to receive the maximum penalty. The 2 15-year-olds, so Wayne Wilmot and the girl, the woman, Carol Ann Arrow, so they received lighter penalties because they were not involved in the actual physical acts of the murder or the assault. So 15-year-old Wayne Wilmot, he got 7 years, a minimum of 7 years in prison and a maximum of 9 years and 4 months. Do you think that that's enough? Do you think that he was unnecessarily, do you think that he should receive a lighter sentence because he wasn't involved in the physical acts, or do you think he should get the same, the maximum, because he was present and he didn't stop? You have to put yourself into his shoes. He's a 15-year-old. Apparently he has mental incapacity, and it would be very hard to stand up to those 3 other boys when they're committing the acts. But what do you think? Do you think that the penalty he received is too light? Carol Ann Arrow, so she received a 3-year good behaviour bond, which is pretty light. Do you think that she was let off too easily? Do you think she should have received a harsher sentence? I think that I need more information with respect to her mental incapacity before I would give a comment on that. Believe it or not, some people in the community were actually very sympathetic to the 14 and the 16-year-old, and they were saying that because of their ages and their upbringing, that the court should have given some leniency and given them the chance to rehabilitate. Well, what do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. So the judge explained that the facts surrounding the crime were so barbaric that he believed that he had no alternative other than to impose the maximum penalty, and he recommended that none of the prisoners should ever be released, the 3 boys. So let's take a look at what has happened since the sentencing of the group. Wayne Wilmot, who was 15 at the time of the murder, he received the second lightest sentence of the group. He went on to reoffend multiple times after his release from prison. He was charged after attacking another woman in 1998, and he was sentenced in 2004 for 12 more years. A psychiatrist described him as incapable of engaging in rehabilitation. Wilmot admitted himself that he was likely to reoffend and hurt another woman again in future. He said that he felt triggered by women's clothing. And he is now one of the state of New South Wales, Australia's worst ever sex offenders. So you have to think, was his sentence too light? No, maybe we should have just locked him up for life when he was involved in this first act. With respect to Carol Ann Arrow, I couldn't find any information on her, so let's just hope that she was able to somewhat rehabilitate and that, she stayed low-key and she hasn't committed any other further offences. The 3 boys who received life sentences, they remain in prison today. In 1997, 2001 and 2005, the New South Wales Parliament passed 3 pieces of legislation which had the result that they would never be released for the rest of their natural life. In 2004, the United Nations Committee found that the sentences handed down for Bronson and Blethington and Matthew Elliott had breached the rights of a child. The committee requested that the case be reviewed to remedy the human rights breaches. The committee said that any sentence handed down in relation to a child must allow for the possibility of review and the prospect of release, notwithstanding the gravity of the crime and the circumstances around it. I don't know how I feel about that. So the committee described their sentences of life and 25 years as cruel and degrading punishment. And my immediate thought is, just like they did, cruel and degrading, just like what they did to Janine, right? She doesn't get a chance to rehabilitate or live her life. In my opinion, it's good news that nothing came from the committee's investigation. It's important to note that Blethington, he's actually lodged several appeals to be released from prison on the grounds that he was a child at the time of the killing. He states that he has since found God and that he is a changed man. Apparently Blethington, he got heavily into God. He found God and he now hosts Bible studies in prison. And he actually counsels other inmates, apparently. So another interesting thing is he found love whilst he was in prison. Something that Janine, she wasn't able to proceed with her marriage and be in love. So interesting. Apparently he found love while he was in prison with a woman named Kim, who he met through his pastor's youth fellowship. The pair planned to live a life together outside of prison, and their relationship lasted 10 years before he apparently broke it off with her and said, I actually don't think I'm going to get out of prison, you should go and live your life. Which, think about that, if that's true, that is a little bit selfless and an indication of potential change, rather than just, trying to string her along and keep her, he wanted to set her free. The Balding family state that they have never received an apology from the gang members, not one of them, even though Blethington publicly claimed that he is remorseful for his actions. Blethington has supporters in the community, in the Australian community, believe it or not. Some of the supporters say that, he was a troubled kid at the time of the offence and that he really should have been given the chance to rehabilitate due to his age. Again, what do you think about this? Let me know in the comment section below. In 1995, Janine's mother, she actually published a book called The Janine Balding Story, and it tells her personal journey. It talks about her personal journey dealing with what happened to her daughter. So it's worth taking a look at if you're interested in this case. Well, that's it for this case. What did you think? Could you see some stark similarities between this case and the Anita Cobby case? Both cases are just so chilling, and they're an example of how much of an influence the gang mentality has on deciding to murder, but also the escalation in violence. And I think it's so profound that these people, these kids, except for the 22-year-old man, they had no links and they had no emotional connection or friendship before this murder. So it really shows how, I think it's a combination of the low socioeconomic demographic and how they were living on the street, and as part of that culture, to be tough and brutal, almost the tougher you were, the worse you're offending, the more brutal you were, the higher your street cred. And it's just such a dangerous thing to have on the streets. I mean, I've been to Central Sydney Station and there's still a lot of homeless people at Central Station. It's like an ongoing issue to today in 2022. So that's why I find this case so interesting, is that gang mentality and how much of an influence that had on the escalation in violence in this case.